All right, and I'm gonna keep my the Discord open. So if you have any questions, feel free to just start talking, or you can message on the MMP 270 channel and I'll see it. So if you have any questions, just put it in there and I'll pause for a second and take a look. But what we're going to be looking at today is character design. So this is our second lecture. And we're just going to be talking about character design. So if you've taken some animation classes or, just like played video games, you probably have a good sense of what character design is. So still, we're going to be talking about some introductory types of terms and talking about how characters function within a game. And then we're going to be kind of thinking about applying those rules to our character designs that we're going to be working on this week. So I'm going to go into slides mode and get started. All right. Okay, so here you see Pac-Man. I don't know if you guys have played Pac-Man before. I'm sure you've seen videos of it at some point, but it's a pretty old game and it has pretty great character design because it's very simple. Our Pac-Man character is just like a circle with a mouth, and so we can kind of see it shows us the direction of the character, and it's brighter than our other characters. It's like the brightest part of the screen, and so it's very easy to see on the screen. And then it also tells us a little bit about the functionality of the character, which is that it eats the dots in our Pac-Man maze. And so that's a really good example of simple character design. And we'll kind of see how this evolves throughout the history of video games. Obviously, you can see this as like a sprite sheet from the original Pac-Man, and they had a very limited palette because they were working with very, a small amount of memory and relatively small processors compared to what we have today. So they had to make use of those constraints to create a game where you could still identify with the character, recognize the non-player characters, the NPCs, which is our ghosts. And then the other thing, if you've ever spent time playing Pac-Man or reading about Pac-Man, you'll remember that there's 4 different ghosts. And if you're not paying attention, you may not notice this, but they all have different functionality. And those functionalities are tied to the same color. So every time you play the game, when you see the red ghost or the blue ghost or the pink or the orange ghost, you can know based on the color what sort of following pattern or following algorithm they use to chase the player. And so if you play enough, you'll start to be able to analyze that, or if you just read like a strategy guide or something like that. And so it's very simple. It's just a bunch of different colors, but they have high contrast from each other. So it's very easy for us to see the different colors. And so as we're playing the game, we can make choices about, our movement strategy to avoid the different ghosts. So very, very simple character design. But it gives us everything that we need to know and understand about the characters in the game to be able to play. So that's a really good example of some of the goals we have with our main character. So there's 2 functions that our main character performs in game design. It gives a player an avatar to identify with in the game world. And we'll talk a little bit about how it does this through this lecture. But we want something on the screen that the player identifies with. So it should be easy to see. It should be clear when I hit a button that it moves. We want that immediate feedback to understand sort of what's happening when we're playing the game. And, we want something that evokes, some sort of identification between the player and what they're seeing on the screen. And so we also want to indicate the functionality of the character. And this can be done in different ways. As I talked about with the Pac-Man, it's really simple. The Pac-Man is just a mouth. And so that shows us the direction. And it also tells us that we're trying to eat all those dots. And if we eat all the dots, we are going to beat the level. So it's really, really simple. Other characters do this in other ways, but we want to give the player a little indication of how their character works, what they can do in the scene. There's a lot of different ways to do that with colors, with accessories and shapes and things like that. And so different games will approach that design in different ways. So next we have Mario, another really simple game. And this tells us a bit about the game world as well. Mario obviously has a lot more detail than the other characters in the game. And Mario also has this bright red outfit that's very easy to identify with. In this game, Mario also tells us a little bit about what makes Mario kind of fun is that they're sort of this like absurdist, almost nonsensical combination of different components that make up the world of the game. So, you know, all of these things in Mario don't really fit together. We have like a plumber, we have these mushrooms, we have these blocks. The overall sense of the game is basically that you know, it's this absurdist landscape that we're trying to navigate through. And Mario has a bunch of very unique features that make it, you know, impossible to miss who Mario is. He has his hat, his overalls, the mustache. Everybody who's played Mario can identify those features. And if you ever see Mario represented, you know, outside of the game, you'll immediately recognize him. So these visual traits don't actually relate necessarily to the functionality of the character. They don't actually really tell us much about what Mario can do in the game world, but it tells us something about the game world itself, this sort of absurd or humorous combination of different elements. Another simple example from an early game. This one is Space Invaders. And you can see the character is similar to Pac-Man in the sense it's just one color. It's, you know, it's a bright green color, so it's easy to identify on the screen. And it's got this, you know, basically it's just a gun pointing up. So that tells us that we can shoot these lasers up at the alien. So again, it's communicating in a very, very simple way what we can expect from the functionality of the avatar or the character that we have control over. So as I mentioned before, early video game systems are limited by the power, the processing power, the graphics power, the number of colors, the hardware, the, you know, physical hardware, and the amount of space on the computer to save information. And so early game designers had to make choices dealing with those constraints that led to some kind of like creative and interesting design choices. So moving forward a little bit, this is a game from 2009 called Canabalt. It's, I don't know, it's not maybe the most popular game, but it is very influential because it sort of spawned the endless runner genre, which is very specific to handheld mobile devices. And you can see in this game, we have like sort of a retro styling. So it's using, even though it's from 2009, and at that point we had games with, you know, more sophisticated 3D graphics and things like this. Since this was supposed to work on mobile, it again is going back to this early sort of pixel retro graphic style because we want it to run fast, and early mobile devices obviously didn't, again, have the same processing power that we're used to with modern PCs. And so the character, again, is very simple. It's just this guy in a suit, and he has really very few distinguishing characteristics, but it's very easy because the black suit stands out against the gray background. We can always kind of identify the character in the game. So this is kind of an interesting example of a modern game that's referencing sort of earlier systems and earlier game design. So in games that we're building today, you know, there's virtually no limitations on the graphic quality of the game, depending on what kind of system you're using. So if you're using a really, really high-end system, you'll see games that have just really incredible photorealistic graphics. So we are not constrained by the number of colors or the number of pixels or other things like that. But we still want to make choices, and we might create artificial constraints to help us make choices in our character design. So another game from a couple years later that uses kind of a similar palette is the game Limbo. I don't know if you guys have seen this. It's a really pretty game, and it was pretty, I think it was pretty popular at the time that it came out as an indie game, and it's very like moody and dark, and it really uses sound and sort of mood and aesthetics really well to create the experience of the game. And the character is really, really simple. It's just this black silhouette with these two white dots for eyes that always really stand out a lot as you're playing the game. So it's always really easy to find the character in the game. So, even though we've moved a little bit farther and we have a lot more access, you can see there's a lot more detail in the scene, even though it's just a 2D scene. You can see there's like multiple different backgrounds and blending between the graphics, but our character is still very, very simple. And the simplicity of the character helps it stand out from the more detailed and more complex background. I see there's let me check the chat real quick. Did they get this smooth scrolling in Super Mario? They weren't doing that beforehand. That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that off my head. Let's see if we can Google that real quick. Oh, wow. All right, so it looks like, yeah, some kind of hardware graphics tricks. Oh, that's interesting. We'll have to look into that more.
I think can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, now I can't hear you.
I think they just figured out that they could essentially generate like what's happening on screen as it's happening instead of having a preloaded level. And so it made it that they could have longer levels that went on for more time.
Okay. Okay, cool. Interesting. Yeah, I don't know a ton about that history, but it sounds like yeah, that would be interesting to look into as far as the differences in how computer graphics have evolved and how that affects the way that games look. Sorry. All right, so let's continue. So another really cool example of character design is the Binding of Isaac. This is a popular 2D dungeon crawler, sort of roguelike game. And it's an indie game from 2011. I assume some of you guys have played this game, but maybe not everybody. But it's a really nice game.
I know a decent amount about it, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it's a really fun game.
Cool.
I definitely recommend it. And it's kind of similar to Pac-Man in the sense that the character design is very tied to the functionality. So the tiers on the character are actually the character's weapon. It comes from a biblical story where the character is crying, and that gets turned into sort of the functionality in the game where you're walking around and searching in this dungeon, but you can actually use your tiers or your weapon, so you can kind of shoot them to attack the enemies. So yeah, video games borrow styles from a lot of different sources, cartoons, comics, anime, film, all sorts of different visual references. So we can see lots of video games of all sorts of different genres and styles borrow from a lot of different styles. And the character design, so with Isaac, we'll see there's often a simple character design that is tied into the game story as well as the functionality. And so this is a capture from the reading or the research assignment that's related to our character design. This is from a book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. I highly recommend this reading, for this class, but really for any class that is related to multimedia or design or animation or game design. Even though it's focused on comics, it's really relevant to any visual medium, especially any sequential visual medium. So any medium that uses narrative or visuals that change over time. And he really goes into visual language and how we communicate with comics. And this is a really good example of basically the idea of a cartoon or an icon and how it relates to how we see things visually. So we see this kind of spectrum between, on the left side, a photorealistic, photo, or I think that's an actual photo of a guy, and then we see it go to a more realistic sort of sketch, and then a slightly less realistic cartoon, an even less realistic cartoon, and then just a flat sort of circle with two eyes that has no real distinguishing features. And in the book, McLeod is basically talking about how we identify with cartoons versus more representational drawings. So with the cartoon all the way on the right, which is almost an icon, it's like an emoji. There's nothing distinguishing about that drawing that would make us think like, oh, it's a man, or it's a woman, or it's a particular nationality or ethnicity or age. There's no real distinguishing characteristics. So anybody who's playing a game with a character like that, or reading a comic book or something like that, anybody could identify with that very simplified icon. Whereas on the left, with the more detail, you may not identify with that character as much. But there may be other advantages to having a highly detailed character if you're trying to tell a very specific story. So we can think about that as we're designing our characters, whether we want to go for more representational, like what we see on the left, versus more cartoonish or iconographic, like what we see on the right. So the aesthetic choices that go into the game design and the character design also will tell the player a little bit about what to expect in the game. And this is kind of related to our first lecture on game design, how we want to lead the player towards the goals. We want to teach them how to play the game. So our visual choices go into that a little bit. We can learn about, what kind of genre or what kind of expectations we might have for the game. And the design can kind of like give the player a little bit of a clue as to what to expect. So another good example of the character design process is this article. I really like this article. It's by an artist, Tama Tataro. And they did these characters based on the Overwatch game. So this isn't the original characters, but he did these 2D drawings based on these and talked a little bit about the process. And so what I like about this is that he has these very specific rules that govern the choices that he makes in his game design. So you don't have to necessarily use the same rules, but it's helpful to have a set of rules so that when you design your characters, they are kind of like recognizable, that they come from the same design perspective. So he has a few components to his design process. So he starts with some shapes, and he kind of gives different meaning to the shape. So, this is subjective. You might have different relationships with these shapes, but this is his sort of interpretation of these shapes and how he uses them from different characters. So for round, these characters are charismatic, harmless, endearing. And you can that kind of makes sense when you think about, characters with a round shape. Box shape is reliable, uniform, traditional. Again, that kind of makes sense with the characteristics of the box geometry. And then triangle is cunning, dynamic, competent. And then he mentions downward pointing is more aggressive. So we see the very simple shape. So that's the very beginning of the design process. And then more complex characters that have multiple different parts of their personality can have different shapes combined together. So you get these, compound or complex characters. So next he does a silhouette. And the point of doing the silhouette is that if it's a strong character, you'll be able to recognize the silhouette just as easily as you can the character design. And that might also be relative to if you have a bunch of different characters, but they all have the same shape, they may not be that easy to distinguish from each other. And so then he does the color. And for this, he chooses 3 colors and he applies the 60-30-10 rule. So again, this is just one rule. You're not required to use this in your own designs, but I think it's good to have these kinds of rules in mind. So he has one color, which is the main color, that makes up about 60% of the design. A second color to make up 30%, and then the last color is 10%. And you can kind of see how that creates this sort of unison or identifiable quality across these different designs, where even though the main color for each one of these different characters is different, there's this sort of like similarity in this proportion. If he's using 2 colors, he just changes it to 730, so 70% one color and 30% the other color. So again, this is just one approach. You don't have to use the same approach, but it's good to kind of develop some rules. Sometimes these types of rules will come out of just doing a bunch of different designs and noticing like, oh, I tend to prefer designs with 3 colors or 2 colors or 5 colors or whatever it is, and then you can start to kind of refine what your approach is. He has a link to some of his inspiration. So that's just one example that I like of the character design process. So one thing that I really want to emphasize, and that is part of this character design assignment, is the iterative process of design. So iterative is a big word. It basically just means doing something multiple times, but changing it as you do it. So that's the important part of iteration. So just repeating something is not iterating. Repeating something, but making a variation, making a change, that's how you iterate. So you start with a design, and then you make another design, and you keep it mostly the same, but you maybe change the color or change the base shape or change some other component. And by iterating on your design, you can refine it and you can come to something that might be stronger than what you originally created. So that's something I really want to emphasize throughout the semester, is that to really get good at design and really any type of creative practice, you can't just draw your character and say, this looks cool, I'm done. Every designer has a process that involves repetition and variation. So you're never going to make the best version of your character the first time you try it. You might have something in your head, and you might need to try a few different versions of it before you find something that really works. So it's good to start with something, make some different changes, and then evaluate if the changes made it stronger or weaker. Think about why that happened, and then continue with the process. So there's no one way to make game art. I'm gonna start with Piskel. As I mentioned when we were doing our art intro, there's the reason I use Piskel. There's a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons is that it's very simple interface, and it's cross-platform, and it's free, so anyone can use it on any computer. And it's very lightweight as well. It's not like a huge program, so it's pretty easy to use. You can even use it in your browser if you can't download it for whatever reason. So that's what we're going to be using, but feel free to use whatever you want, and we can figure out one of the main things. The other real advantage with Piskel, which we'll really see on Thursday, is exporting. It's designed to work with games, so it's designed well to export to use in games. So that's another thing. If you want to use Photoshop or Illustrator or another art program, that's fine, but you may have to figure out a process to export your art so that it works with the game. I can help you do that, but we'll have to see. I think it's possible to do it in a lot of different contexts, but it's very easy to do with Piskel. So yeah, few links to check out. We already saw this character design tips. This is a YouTube video on designing a game character.
You can easily train yourself to listen faster.
Let's see, once the ad is done. This goes through a lot of this whole long process talking about the functionality of this character. This is a really good example. This is using Photoshop, but you can do similar things in Piskel. So that's a good one to check out if you want to get some more inspiration. This link is just to a lot of videos on Piskel. So just different Piskel tutorials. We did a little intro to Piskel, and I'm going to continue to talk about how to use it. But if you want more in depth, this is a good place to get it. There's a whole playlist right here. So if you see, I click here, there's the playlist. So you can see there's a whole bunch of videos. They're all pretty short. So if you want more information on Piskel, that's a good place to find it. And then I think this is another tutorial just about character design for games. So it goes into a little bit more detail, some different types of programs and different options to check out. So that's another good resource if you want to do some research and think about how to create your character. Okay, so I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna stop my recording.